Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alyssa Silva, and welcome to today's program presented by AJU's Wizen Center for Open Learning. We're thrilled to have you with us for Irish Jewry Through the Ages Part 1. And just a reminder, this is Part 1 of a 3-part series. So be sure to check out the chat for the link for Part 2 and Part 3, but don't worry, we'll remind you as well at the end. We're thrilled to have you with us. We'll be exploring the fascinating and often overlooked history of Jewish life in Ireland. It's a story of migration, resilience, and cultural identity. But it's an absolute privilege to welcome our esteemed speaker, Dr. Melanie Brown, who's joining us live from Dublin, Ireland. Dr. Brown is a music graduate of Trinity College Dublin and holds an MA in composition from NUI Maynooth. And in 2011, she earned her PhD in ethnomusicology from the University of Limerick. She currently serves as a local center examiner for the Royal Irish Academy of Music, and she teaches a course on Jewish liturgical music at the World Academy of Music and dance at the University of Limerick. Additionally, Dr. Brown is the director of the Irish Jewish Oral History Project, an initiative under the auspices of the Jewish Representative Council of Ireland. She is dedicated to preserving the voices of stories of Ireland's Jewish community, which is why we are so excited to have her here with us today to do just that with all of you. But before we begin, we would like to extend our deepest gratitude to our generous anonymous donor, whose support has made this program possible. Their commitment to Jewish learning and historical exploration allows us to continue offering enriching opportunities like this one for all of you. If you would like to sponsor a program like this, you can contact us online. You can contact me at alyssa.silva@aju.edu, or you can visit our donation link, which will be shared in the chat as well. But without further ado, I'm going to let Dr. Melanie Brown take it away and introduce you to the incredible history of Irish Jewry through the ages.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alyssa. Thank you for your very kind introduction. It's lovely to be here, folks. So as Alyssa said, I'm talking to you from Dublin, so we're in a very different time zone this evening. So it's actually 8 o'clock in the evening here right now. So it's absolutely delightful to be with you. So thank you very much for your interest in this topic. So I'll give you a little bit of background as to why I am so interested in this topic. So as Alyssa made reference to, I wrote a doctoral dissertation a number of years ago on the Jewish liturgical music, specifically of Dublin, a fairly narrow and limited field. And whereas I'd always taken an interest in Irish Jewish history, and I used to volunteer at our little Irish Jewish museum here, I found that through the music, in the studying the music, I found that more and more of the history unfolded itself and revealed itself to me. And that's really where my interest lay. And subsequently, I taught in the University of Dublin at Trinity College. I taught a course on Irish and Jewish identities, and I taught that for a number of years. And I'll make reference to that a little later in the course. So that's really where as I said, my interest in the research of the history comes from. So what I often find when we start to discuss Irish Jewish history is that there's a bit of a surprise that there's a Jewish community in Ireland at all. Because I think the public perception of Ireland abroad is, well, it's largely a Catholic country and there's not much in the way of sort of intercultural communication and so forth. And that would be the case. And I mean, I don't want to get too bogged down with the sort of recent political history of Ireland and the you might say the revolution and everything, from 1922, but it is relevant to us in a sense, because that's where Irish identity, modern Irish identity, very much originates from there, and from 1922 when the Free State was established and when Ireland devolved itself from British rule, which had really gone on for virtually 1,000 years before that. And with that, really the formation of Irish identity very much was through Roman Catholicism. And there were a number of key players, the President of Ireland at the time, and also a very influential Roman Catholic Archbishop McQuaid. And they very much established, as I said, Irish identity as a Roman Catholic one. But of course, there was a relatively small Protestant population here, and a very, very small Irish population, Irish Jewish population by 1922. So again, there's a perception sometimes that, okay, Jews came to Ireland in around about, the 1920s when it became, when independence was declared. There's a perception I often come across is that, well, there were no Jews in Ireland until after the war, which is not true. And sometimes there's a perception, well, there can't be any Jews in Ireland, how ridiculous that is. So I'm going to take you back, because I mean, that's one of the interesting things about historical research is that, sometimes you have a paper trail and there's evidence, and sometimes, you have to join the dots. There's a bit of guesswork involved in that. So I'm going to take you right back to the time of the Normans. So we're really talking about the 11th century. And it is surprising, I think, to think that there was a Jewish presence in Ireland, right back at that time. But one of the most famous quotations, when we talk about, medieval times and prior to that, when we talk about Jews in Ireland, is that there is actually a reference in what we call the Annals of Inishfallen. And the Annals are history that was written by the monks contemporaneously. So if we're talking about 1079, there's a clear reference to Jews. So let's see if we can try and share this with you. We'll have a go. So here we have 5 Jews came over the sea with gifts to, that word is Turlock, that's how we pronounce that. So 5 Jews came over the sea with gifts to Turlock, and they were sent back again over the sea, and that's the Annals of Inishfallen in 1079. Now, there's a few problems with that. It doesn't say very much. We appreciate that. It doesn't tell us a great deal. And in a way, it leaves out a lot more than it tells us, because actually, who were the Jews? Who were the Jews? Where did they come from? Why did they come with gifts to Turlock? Had they been in contact with him before? Was it just that particular party? Was there a crew? Did they have family? Who were there? So, when we mine into that little bit of text a bit, that there's just so many questions that nobody can answer. I mean, I haven't answered, and I'm not in, I think in the first international rank of historians, but those that are also haven't actually managed to find out who they were, where they came from, probably from the south of Spain, probably Santander, somewhere like that, because they were trade routes. But exactly what they were doing there, we don't really know. And we don't know how long they stayed. I mean, did they just tumble out of the boat, go to Turlock, give the gifts, and then row off back again? I mean, this seems very unlikely. So remember, at the time, the monks obviously were very constrained as to what they could record anyway. And indeed, these fellows might not have been Jewish at all. They might have been dark with different beards to the monks, and that's why they were called Jews. So in fact, though this quotation is used an awful lot in the context of showing, okay, the Irish Jewish community has been around a long time, that this actually doesn't tell us very much. It doesn't tell us very much at all. And I'm going to skip forward about a century or so, because that's what I'm going to probably do during this course. I will skip forward and skip back again, because sometimes what happened beforehand informs what happened afterwards, and vice versa. So forgive me if I do that a little bit. But I'm now going to skip forward to 1232. So we're still in the time of the Normans. And in 1232, we know that there's a sufficient number of Jews in Ireland.
Dr. Brown, sorry,
Yeah,
are you trying to share your screen?
No, I switched it off again.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. Continue. Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Thanks. Because it's just a short sentence, so I turned it off again. So what we have is in 1232, we know that there's a sufficient number of Jews in Ireland that the Viceroy of Ireland, so this is a viceroy who's been sent by the Norman king at the time, and that was King Henry III, so a long time ago, and he has charged a viceroy called Pierre de Riveau, whose sole job is to protect the Jews of Ireland. So this is in 1232, so we know there is obviously a settlement there. Now, again, the problem here is there's just no paper trail. We just don't know who these Jews were. We don't know where they lived. We don't know what their function was. We just know that they were there because in the primary sources we're told, you know, that this viceroy, Pierre de Rivaux, had this responsibility to protect the Jews. So what the Jews are really doing in Norman Britain and Ireland at the time, you know, it's largely trade. You know, they've come over from France. And one of the main reasons I think that they were tolerated, of course, is that there's this huge super tax. So the Jews were tolerated in the British Isles, but as long as they paid their enormous super tax. So you may well have heard of the great expulsion of Jews from the British Isles in 1290, which happened, and you know we can contextualize that with the Spanish Inquisition and all these things. But essentially, what happened in the British Isles at that time was that you know there were the Normans had been to war. They had come back with other sources of revenue during the Crusades. And essentially, they didn't need the Jews and their super tax anymore, so they were expelled in 1290, which is fine. But the thing is that it's not like today where you know you could do that because everybody has some form of identification, one can be found. But in those days, you know, it is very likely that there were still Jews remaining. And in fact, we know as a fact that there was a very influential Jewish doctor living now in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. So, you know, we've gone down past the Normans now, Elizabeth I. So we're talking really about the sort of the 1500s. And this Jewish doctor is quite an interesting story called Rodrigo Lopez, who worked at the court of the Queen. So an important man, you know, openly professing his Judaism, and lived there for quite some time. Now, unfortunately for Rodrigo Lopez, he got involved with a Spanish-sponsored plot to murder the Queen, and he was found out and they hanged him in a place called Tyburn in London, which was where public executions took place, and that was the end of Rodrigo Lopez. So this is really, you know, so something that we know going on certainly in the 15th century. So we don't know a great deal after that because Jews simply aren't supposed to be in Britain or Ireland. So if we scroll on again, so I'm afraid I'm disgracefully going to be scrolling on now a couple of centuries. But as I said, you know, there is just a problem with paper trail. And as these people are not supposed to be in Britain or Ireland, you know, there's very little in the way of documentary evidence. So I think a lot of you have heard of Oliver Cromwell. And Oliver Cromwell, you know, he's a very contested figure in British and Irish history because, of course, in British terms, you know, he's the person that deposed the monarchy, which is good or bad, depending on, you know, how you see these things. And he brought a certain degree of wealth and prosperity. And he also was responsible for the sort of official plantation of Ireland. So he brought a lot of people essentially from Scotland and from the Scottish Highlands, and unilaterally seized land in this part of the world and gave it to English and Scottish people. So over here, there's no argument that Cromwell is seen as a very bad person indeed in Ireland. And in Britain, as I said, you know, they see him in a slightly different way. But one thing that you might say the benefit to Jews of Oliver Cromwell was that Oliver Cromwell formally readmitted Jews to the British Isles, so both to, you know, mainland Britain and also to Ireland. And this was mostly done on foot of the deposition from Manasseh ben Israel. So we'll try and share this one again now. So this is the front cover and first couple of pages of Manasseh ben Israel's deposition to Oliver Cromwell. And Manasseh ben Israel was, you know, an important person himself. You can see, you know, he's actually a doctor. He's a medical doctor, a divine. So, you know, he's an important religious figure. And he's petitioning Oliver Cromwell to admit Jews to the British Isles. And the reason for this is that he is saying, well, Jews in Europe are really having a terrible time. under the Inquisition, under the Spanish Inquisition and the Portuguese Inquisition. And you're finding these very established Jewish communities, you know, that they are forced to leave, or else, you know, that they're going to have, you know, very, very unpleasant things administered to them. Now I see there's a hand raised there. If somebody has a question.
Let's save questions to the end, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So anybody with a question, you know, do ask it. I can't absolutely guarantee I can answer, but I'll have a go anyway. So anyway, we're talking about Manasseh ben Israel. Manasseh, as I said, you know, the first thing he says is, you know, we would very much like to be readmitted. And I'm not going to show you the entire address here, because, you know, it runs through about 25 pages and it's not that easy to read. But in a nutshell, what he's saying is essentially, if you readmit the Jews to the British Commonwealth, we'll be really great citizens and we'll be loyal to you and we will pay lots of taxes to you and we'll do whatever you like. So that's very much the first half of the disposition, is saying we'll be great, you know, we'll just be absolutely great if you have us back. And then the second half is a very, very visceral description of what is happening to Jews under the Inquisition, and it makes very difficult reading indeed. And in any event, this is certainly part of the reason that Jews were admitted to the Commonwealth. Now, you know, there are other reasons as well. There's a lot of sort of historical debate as to, well, you know, did Manasseh, was this the most important reason, or was it just simply that, well, Cromwell saw, okay, you know, there'll be a financial benefit, or there'll be, you know, some sort of social benefit to bringing Jews back to the Commonwealth. So for whatever reason, anyway, we find this situation whereby Jews are readmitted to the Commonwealth, and this, of course, has implications for Dublin, because now Dublin, believe it or not, was the second city of the Commonwealth. So you had London and you had Dublin. So if we move this on, let's try and move this on. This is a place called Crane Lane. So believe it or not, there's been a synagogue in Dublin since around 1655. It's a very long time ago. So when people ask, you know, really, how long has the Jewish community been settled there? Well, you know, we have all this Norman history and things like that, but nobody really knows. But certainly there is documentary evidence that there was a synagogue established here in 1655. And this was established here by you know, some of the very early settlers who came back under Cromwell's, you know, suggestion. And I don't know if any of you have ever been to Dublin, or maybe you have, or maybe you haven't, but we're talking about the city centre of Dublin, and you may know where Trinity College is. Trinity College actually doesn't appear on this map, so it hasn't in fact been built at the time that the synagogue was established. But here's Dame Street. Trinity College is up there somewhere, just to give you a frame of reference. The River Liffey is here, so we can see all the boats here. And this is a little lane called Crane Lane, which essentially leads down to the River Liffey, which is the main river that runs through Dublin. And there is a little street here, and at the back of these two houses, there is two little, looks like outhouses here, and that was actually the first synagogue in 1655, and it was set up by a family who were here for a very long time, and these were Portuguese Jews, and they were called Pereira. So you had a branch of the Pereira family living here, and we'll come back to the Pereira family later, because they were really incredibly important within a European Jewry at this time. So they're very wealthy and influential people. They're a bit like a Jewish Medici. They're really very important, and they have you know, they seem to be involved in all sorts of you know, political and financial businesses. And we have Pereiras over here in the second city of the Commonwealth. And, you know, Cromwell is going to be deposed, you know, round about now, and the crown is going to be re-established, but that's fine. The Jewish community is established here by the Pereira family in a tiny little building. and it's really, really small. And the reason for this strange scribble here is that whereas I've seen quite a number of references to the Crane Lane Synagogue in books, there were never any drawings or any pictures, which was strange. And then I came across, in the context of another talk that I gave, I came across this gentleman who said, well, actually, our family business owned the building where that synagogue was. And I said, well, that's fantastic. Can you describe it to me? He said, this is about 10 years ago. I came across him. And he said, I can describe it to you. And essentially, here's your Crane Lane. So that's, where we were. And here's the outhouses. And in this tiny little building here, that was the synagogue. He's not a very good artist. And he's saying, this is the front entrance. He said, we didn't understand when we took over the building, well, there was this gallery around. And I was explaining, well, Jewish orthodoxy, the women would have sat up there. And seemingly the ark would have been here. And he said that there was a strong room, for storing treasure. And unfortunately, the whole building was burned down in the 1980s. There was a big fire there, and that was left. And one of the things that annoys me slightly is that there's a couple of very seminal texts on Irish Jewish history, and there are very clear references to this. What annoys me a little bit is that the building was still standing at the time these things were written, and neither of the authors actually went to visit the site. And as this gentleman told me, well, the whole business community around this area at the time knew that this was a synagogue. And I just find it a pity that the historians themselves didn't actually go and investigate. But in any case, this is now the only sort of, you might say, documentary evidence of the synagogue, is this little scrap of paper, which does sound a bit strange, but that's the way it is. And we know now, because if there was a ladies' gallery, we know now that, of course, these people had their families there. Now, we know that they were involved in the army commissariat. So they were involved in feeding the army. Sorry, let's just come back to that one again. So I just touched something there. So the Pereira family are involved with the army commissariat. The army is situated in Dublin Castle, which is sort of down there somewhere. And there must have been a certain amount of wealth there because they've got this strong room. So that's an important thing to consider. Now, another important thing to consider, that if you have of course an established Jewish community, and given that lifespans were not as they were, in the 1600s, what happens to the dead? Because there must have been some. And, we were aware that the synagogue operated for a good 50 years. We're aware of that. So where did they bury their dead? And there is a perception, and I've heard this, they must have gone to London to bury the dead. But, can you imagine making the journey from Dublin to London by horse and very slow ferry? I can't imagine that it's very likely. And I came across quite by accident, because there's no reference to this really in any of the texts. There's no reference to this, but there was a synagogue down in the country. So I'd say about 100 miles away from here, I actually found reference to a Jewish cemetery. So let's have a go here. So this is the Grand Jewry map of County Meath, and you see it's 1812. And if we look very closely, we find a Jewish cemetery. So here's Castle Core, and you see here the Jews' burial ground. And it said at the back of the volume where this map was, it said that by the time this map had been drawn in 1812, this Jews' burial ground had been disused. And in Irish law, that means there would have been no burials there for 100 years. So by 1712, nobody's been buried here. So the mystery is, well, who are these Jews and what are they doing being buried? And I really mean this. This is absolutely in the middle of nowhere, in rural farmland in County Meath, which is a bit sort of north and west of where I am in Dublin. So, I mean, it's still farmland and a very, very obscure place. So I figured, well, I'll go and see this. This is very, very curious, because I've never seen a reference to this in actually in any literature, any historiography on Irish Jews. There's no reference to Jews in Meath, and certainly not a Jewish cemetery. So I went with my brother, who is actually quite a distinguished historian, and my father, who's an engineer, and we went and we found the place. And here's the place. So as I said, you can see there's this sort of shoulder-high weeds. There's all these ancient trees here. And in fact, we really didn't see anything until we'd gone under a great deal of undergrowth, and we found this stile. So, I mean, I think the gate itself is fairly modern, but the stile really isn't. And because there's a stile there, well, obviously somebody must have needed to access this place. And if you see in the extreme background there, that's my brother there. And this was, you know, as I said, about 10, 12 years ago. And of course, we didn't just wander there. We made contact with the Meath Architectural and Heritage Society that does an awful lot of work, you know, on local history, and they were very interested and they facilitated us greatly. And we used that 1812 map that you've just seen, and also we navigated using a modern Ordnance Survey map. And we made a lot of mistakes. It took us about a day to find the place, and we found all sorts of things, you know, disused wells that we thought might be the place. But we found a few iron posts. And my brother and I are the children of a civil engineer, so we had our string and our sticks and things, and we plotted out the site, and it was this little diamond-shaped site. So there was no question to us, this is the place. But it was so lost and so forgotten, and we've no idea really who's buried there. And except, so we reckon, yes, from 1712, that there's been no burials there. So we know as a fact that, of course, a cemetery was set up in Dublin. Now this says in the year 5618, which translates to 1857. That's just when the prayer house was built, but actually the synagogue was established in 1714. So it's about right. You know, the one in Meath was decommissioned in 1712, and this was established in 1714. Now this prayer house at Ballybock, this is quite a famous landmark in the area. And this used to be you might say, the Chapel of Rest, which was converted, I think, in the 60s into the caretaker's house. Now, unfortunately, the cemetery has been disused for a very long time, and the city council has taken it over, so we can't get access to it at the moment. But we're hoping at some point we will be able to. There was a lot of spoliation in the, you know, during the early 20th century, and, you know, people had taken gravestones out, and, you know, it's certainly been told a number of times that Jewish gravestones were found in the hearths of houses that were built, you know, in the early 20th century in the area. So as I said, there was a lot of desecration. There are a number of stones left that certainly hasn't been used for burial for many, many years. But obviously that's where the community then set up. And the thing about Ballybock is that it was at the time outside the confines of Dublin City. So whereas there would have been an issue with Jews owning property within the city limits, Ballybock is just outside the city limits on the north side of the city. And so that's where they had the cemetery. So if we think a little bit about these other people. So let's just go back for 1 second. Sorry, so we'll just go back to 1 second. We'll just go back for one moment. We'll go back to Castlecore for a second, because there is a theory, in fact, who could be buried there. Now, you may have heard of the Glorious Revolution in Ireland, or the Battle of the Boyne, or, you know, the point at which King William, you know, the Dutch king, comes over and challenges, you know, King James, the great Catholic king. And in a very obscure twist of fate, 12 Jewish bakers were sent over from Amsterdam to feed the Dutch army. And they were stationed in Meath because, you know, the river, the Boyne runs through there. And whereas it's documented, because in Amsterdam, you know, they've got the most incredible public records, you know, going back many, many hundreds of years. So the names of these bakers are in fact known. What isn't known is what happened to them after the war. So they're seconded to Ireland solely to feed the army. And after the war is over, we don't really know what happened to them. So it is possible, it is just a theory, that perhaps the 12 Jewish bakers who fed King William's army during the Battle of the Boyne were cut down and were buried in this little graveyard. It's not impossible, but nobody really knows. And that's the thing about historical research. As I said, sometimes you just have to have a theory. Sometimes you just have to join the dots a bit. And that's what makes life very interesting. Now, what else is interesting? You might remember I made reference to the Pereira family a few minutes ago. Now, the Pereira family, a member of the Pereira family was in Amsterdam and had actually sent these bakers over and because he had contact, of course, with his first cousin who's living in Dublin. So it's really a very small world. It's a very small world indeed. So that's just a little historical aside. So we come back to Ballybock, and we go on a little bit because I'm going to stop sharing now for a little bit. I'm going to just talk to you directly here. Now, so the reason I'm just stopping sharing now, so I'll talk to you a little bit directly, is because at this point now we've got this cemetery in Ballybock, we've got this established, and I know I'm sort of perhaps concentrating a little bit on cemeteries, but obviously without what he's supposed to do at the you know, let's say the termination or the terminal point of communities. And the thing is that there's actually very little documentary evidence now of a community around about here. So really from about the year 1700, other than the establishment of the cemetery, we don't really know much about the Jews that were living here. We don't think that there were very many. We know that they're based around the north inner city, and we know that they're involved in trade. But that's really all we do know about them. So they seem to have kept themselves fairly secret. So if we go on a little bit. So I'm just giving you a few streetscapes around the north inner city of Dublin, because now we were aware that this is a very peripatetic little community. So there's not very many of them. And when I say peripatetic, and I don't mean to patronize, it's not a word everybody knows. It just means they're moving around a lot. So there's no established synagogue at this point. There's no established synagogue at all. And we are aware that, you know, people, you know, we have this little Jewish community that they are practicing, and they're having their services, you know, in industrial buildings and in people's homes. And we know that there was a building here where this rather strange cow is situated on top, I have to say, of an old Protestant graveyard, which I think is a very disrespectful thing. But before even it was a Protestant graveyard, there was another building there. And seemingly we were aware that there was Jewish worship went on there. There was Jewish worship went on in the building that preceded this building. And there was Jewish worship going on this street which was previously called Wolf Tone Street. So that's the main reason that I'm showing you pictures that perhaps don't tell us very much, but it's just to give you, just to maybe contextualize the place a little bit. Dublin is very small and it's very low rise. And, you know, this is fairly typical of the area. So as I said, you know, synagogue locations around, you know, they're all vanished. I mean, I'm aware of Jewish worship taking place in a glass factory nearby these places. So it's all, you know, nowadays people might say a bit random, but this is where people are. But let's move it on a little bit. But moving on to Mary's Abbey Synagogue. So Mary's Abbey is a little street. Here we are in this area that I've just shown you. Mary's Abbey is this little street. And there was actually an abbey there, and the abbey was a very large complex, and even before this time it had been broken up into you might say lots. And it does sound strange when you think about it for there to be a Jewish synagogue in an abbey, but you know, Ireland is a bit like that. You know, it's an island, and sometimes, you know, we just do what's convenient to ourselves. And this little building here, it's very, very undistinguished. It's destined to be pulled down at any stage now. It's currently used just as fruit storage, because there are a lot of fruit markets in this area. And if you look very, very closely, there's actually not the mezuzah on the door, but there's a shadow of the mezuzah is actually just there. And this is the deeds. So this you know, demonstrates, well, actually the building was owned by certain Jewish gentlemen, you know, that they held the building, and this is where the worship took place. So let's just going to come back to you for a second. So as I said, there's not much to see there, and as it's just used as a warehouse, you know, it was obviously stripped of any sort of religious function quite a long time ago. So what do we know about the Jews that set up this particular synagogue? We know now that these are German Jews. So whereas the previous sort of settlement of Jews would have tended to be Sephardic Jews, you know, who came over from Portugal, and then there's a gap. But we know for certain that these are German Jews, and we know some of the names, you know, that there's Rosenthals and so forth. So we know the names. And these are essentially middle-class merchants, and they can well afford to buy this building, you know, for their own purposes. And they are worshipping here. You know, they're educating certainly their sons in Protestant schools in the inner city. They're educating you at Trinity. There's a very interesting library if you ever visit Dublin, and I hope you will. It's quite a nice place. And if you go to St. Patrick's Cathedral, which is, you know, one of the great medieval cathedrals of Europe. So if you ever go there, you can visit what we call Marsh's Library, which is many hundreds of years old. And if you look at the visitors book, which is going for many hundred years, you actually see quite a number of the Jewish names at that time. So, you know, they're reading in Marsh's Library. So Marsh's Library, it's a very important cultural icon in the city, and in common with a lot of cultural icons in Dublin. Of course, it's really small, because Dublin is really small. And, you know, even St. Patrick's Cathedral, by international terms of giant medieval cathedrals, it is relatively small, a very austere, but an austerely beautiful building. So I think I went off topic a little bit there, sort of acting as a sort of a tour guide. But the reason I'm telling you this, of course, is that we have this little synagogue. Believe it or not, it's actually bought from the Unitarian Church. So this was a little Unitarian chapel, you know, under the confession of the Presbyterian faith, and the Unitarians had received a large legacy from one of the big whiskey companies here, Jameson's Whiskey, and they'd moved around the corner to bigger premises. So we have this little synagogue here. Now, the accommodation of the synagogue is tiny. Now, we're aware in the census of Dublin at the time that there's about 300 Jews living in Dublin, and they're all based around about the north inner city, or they're working around the north inner city. There's around 300 of them. The accommodation for the synagogue is for about 20. So we have to conclude from that it's you know, a fairly assimilated community. But they have the synagogue, obviously, you know, for social and religious reasons, and this is obviously necessary for the function of the community. And that was established in about 1836, and they were settled there for a long time. And I'm going to jump forward a little bit now, because I want to leave a bit of time for questions at the end. So I'm going to jump forward a little bit. So we're at 1836, and I'm going to jump forward roughly 50 years now, which is very cheeky of me. But as I said, there's not really much more to tell. There's not a huge amount of documentary evidence of what these people are doing, other than the fact that they're of German abstraction, they are middle class, and they're a reasonably well educated and well-off community. And we're going to move on from Mary's Abbey to another streetscape. So I imagine some of you at least will have heard the concept of Dublin's Little Jerusalem. You may well have heard of that. Now, the bad news about Dublin's Little Jerusalem is that the people who actually lived there never ever used that expression. It was an expression that was invented about 20 years ago by somebody who published a sort of an autobiographical book on the subject of growing up Jewish, you know, in this area of Dublin, and he called it Dublin's Little Jerusalem. Prior to that, there really was no use of the term at all. So just you know, in the interests of you know, of sort of correct terminology, there's no such place really as Dublin's Little Jerusalem. But this is a different streetscape. So I've been talking about the north inner city of Dublin. And if you're a Dubliner, of course, you know, there's a very big difference between the north and the south. I'm on the south side here, and, you know, setting foot on the north side, you know, what a thing to do. And of course, Dublin is bisected by the River Liffey, if I didn't explain that. So anything north of the Liffey is the north, and I'm in the south here. But here we have a streetscape which still exists, just again in the south inner city. And all of this area really was developed from about the 1870s onwards. And, you know, these are all buildings that are very familiar to me. My father grew up in a building like this, for instance, and, you know, this is all fairly standard. So I'm just to give you a little bit of local colour. We're talking about a place called Circular Road, and particularly Portobello. And there's our little Grand Canal, which is not grand. It's a tiny little thread of water that's disused now. It goes through that part of the city. But so this is the streetscape of Portobello. And the reason really that I'm telling you this, I'm gonna come out of that now for a second. The reason that I'm telling you this is that about 50 years late, about 50 years after this little synagogue was established in the former Unitarian chapel, around 15 years later, we've got the May laws enacted in Russia by Tsar Alexander III. And I'm sure lots of you know the implications of this, but just in case you need reminding, of course, the discriminatory May laws of 1882, of course, it denied the vast Jewish communities across the entire Russian Federation. It denied them their civil rights, and it found, a lot of land grabbing, a lot of compelling, a lot of compulsion to live, in the Jewish Pale of settlement and so forth. It also was, I suppose, it created the compulsion for Jews to leave this area. And remember, these are very, very old Jewish communities, a very interesting tapestry of Jewish society there. Because I think sometimes there is a perception of just Eastern European Jewry and that's the end of it. But of course, within Eastern European Jewry, you've got many facets. Certainly by this time, certainly by the late 19th century, you've got the emergence of the communist movement, and you've got the ultra-Orthodox, you've got socialism, you've got all these things that are in their emergent stages really towards the end of the 19th century. And anyway, this has this great swathe cut across it because of the discriminatory May laws. So by which we find an awful lot of Jewish people leave the Russian Federation. And in one of these odd twists of fate, some of them establish themselves in Ireland, this tiny island, off an island, off Europe, a long way away from anywhere. But, at the time, relatively safe and peaceful, though that was to change, within a couple of decades, that would change. But we find that, a lot of Jews, they would have landed in, ports like Liverpool or Glasgow. And then it's really a very short step to come over to Ireland from there. It really doesn't take very long. So we have this influx now of Russian Jews coming over to Ireland. I know I've potted the history shamefully, but we only have an hour really, and that includes questions. But so remember, we had our our sort of well-heeled upper crust German Jews over in the north side, and now we've got this whole influx of Jews coming into the south side. And one of the reasons that they landed, of course, one of the reasons that this is this part of Dublin is where they landed. As I said, this was all redeveloped around about then. And there was also what we called the Dublin Artisan Dwelling Company, which essentially set up social housing at the time. So you had access, to relatively cheap housing, and it was all new at the time. I have to tell you, these are beautiful houses inside. These are beautiful, even the tiny ones. They're beautifully designed. They're very easy to live with. Though they look tiny, they're very spacious. They've got gardens for people to, sort of at the time to keep chickens and grow vegetables. These are really very, very nice places. And of course, you can imagine there's really very little contact between the two Jewish communities. You've got your very assimilated Jewish community on the one hand on the north side, and on the other hand, now you've got this new community coming here to the south side. And so what happens in 1883, we have our first synagogue established on this side of the city. So I'm going to wrap up talking quite soon, and we'll leave the floor open maybe for a few questions. So I just wanted to show you, this is the first synagogue established on this side of the city. And it's very different from, that really, at the time, quite elegant little chapel that they had over on the north side. So this is actually, it's just a dwelling house. It's just a house. And anyway, this was brought over. It was converted to a synagogue. The front room of the house was essentially where the sanctuary was. This is where the prayers were said. The rest of the house is used as offices. There's a kitchen and the usual things down the back. And this was really the first official place where Jewish worship it took place in the south. So of course, we are aware that prayers were taking place in people's homes, and that's a very important thing to point out. But this house here is the very first house where we'd established an actual synagogue. And if we just go on to the next slide, and then maybe we'll have a few questions then at the end. So if we go on to the next slide, and this is the second synagogue that was established in another dwelling house. And it's on a tiny little street called Oakfield Place. It's quite derelict. I mean, this house is quite derelict. But I'm told by somebody who was just a boy at the time, this is established a couple of years later, in 1885, somebody who was a boy at the time that the synagogue was closed, 30 years later, was that its nickname was the Gates of Heaven Ajar, not for any great religious reason, but because the roof was stove in and you could see the sky, and they used to call it the Gates of Heaven Ajar. Presumably it had a great religious significance. So I'm going to wrap up here. So that really brings us, we've really brought ourselves from medieval times right up until the late 19th century. And as I said, there's certain questions I can't answer just simply because the documentation and the firm evidence doesn't exist. Possibly it does, I just haven't come across it. And as I say, there are better historians than I that haven't either. So I'm afraid I've had to skip a few years here and there. But we've come from the Norman times, we've seen the re-establishment of Jews during the Commonwealth under Cromwell. We've seen this trickle in then of German Jews then in the mid-19th century for, largely for mercantile reasons. And now we've started to follow the trajectory of Jews out of Russia. And obviously, a great many Jews in America will come from the very same stock. And of course, there are apocryphal stories here about people settling in Cork, in the south of the country, and saying, well, we thought it was New York, but that it's actually Cork, but we stayed there. I don't think there's any truth in that at all. But, it's a nice story. And there's lots of nice stories about Irish Jews, which, and I very much hope that you'll all come back next week, because we'll go much more into the social history next week. And I promise you it'll be, anyway, it'll be more interesting, but there'll be certainly lots to talk about next week. So
We have some questions from the audience.
Yeah, lovely.
If you don't mind me asking. Okay. This one's from Bruce Portnoy. Did the disdain for Jews in Ireland have its sustaining ability based on the historic, I guess you'd call it meme now, that Jews were responsible for Christ's death? And will it ever end?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. And I mean, I'm sorry to say, yeah, the blood libel, it has a very big place in modern anti-Semitism and in historical anti-Semitism here. And I'd like to say differently, but I mean, they're still teaching it in schools. They're still teaching, the Jews killed Jesus, the Jews have horns, you're finding this all over the place. I used to be very involved in interfaith work. And, I wasn't impressed when I was visiting a school, primary schools, little children, where this is being taught. And so, yeah, obviously this is not helpful. And it is definitely, it is an issue. And no, I can't see that there's any easy way of eliminating these perceptions, and especially nowadays. And I'll talk about this a little more next week and also the week after. I'll talk a bit more about this type of prejudice. But it's just it's this hardcore religious prejudice, and in a religious place like Ireland, it's not an easy thing to fight. I don't know if that helps, but it might help a little bit.
When it comes, this is from Carol Greenberg.
Yep.
When it comes to the cemeteries, which are obviously very important, is there any push from historians or the Jewish community to hire archaeologists with survey equipment to scan the area for actual graves and other information? Have you kind of heard of any of this, or 23andMe-ish progress going on?
Yeah, goodness, I tried myself. I mean, at the time, when I went down with my family, when we went down to Meath, for instance, that place in the thick in the undergrowth. And I mean, we certainly found the place according to the map. That was the place. And then I did contact the Meath County Council, which is responsible for these things. And I said, you know, we found this place. It is of historical interest. There's lots of things of historical interest in Meath. You know, they're always going on about this if you ever come here. And, you know, it's part of the great, the Wild Atlantic Trail and all these things. And I spoke to the county archaeologist and I said, you know, this is important. And he said, you know, yes, this is really important. It's really exciting. We're really, really interested in it. But the thing is, Dr. Brown, we've no money and actually we're not that interested in it. And that's the end. And I have not been able to persuade any official archaeologists to take an interest in it at all. So
Well, if there are any official archaeologists in the audience, you know who to talk to.
I don't know that. And then I have to admit, then I had quite a nasty accident not long after those interactions. So I have to say, you know, I lost a bit of interest in the, you know, in the whole trajectory of you know, sort of persuasion, you might say, after that. But no, I mean, the land is still there. And I mean, every so often I do raise these issues because I give quite a lot of these talks, and I do raise this issue from time to time, and people are always very interested. And they say, "Oh, well, we'll get together some volunteers and go down there," but then, you know, the interest just goes away. And so far, I haven't been able to persuade anybody to actually do this. And if anybody in the audience thinks, "Yeah, okay, I know somebody who can do that," please go ahead. I'd love that.
Another question from Susan Bennett.
Yeah.
How long did the Sephardic Jews remain in Dublin?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. We're aware of the presence for about 50 years. So from about 1655 or 1660, thereabouts, for about 50 years. And after that, there's total silence. They just seem to have disappeared after that. I'm assuming that they would have gone back to London because the congregation at Crane Lane, it was a sort of an offshoot of you know, the main Sephardic London synagogue at the time there at the East End, Bevis Marks, and the little synagogue that preceded Bevis Marks. So the likelihood is, of course, that they just, that those that were surviving, that they went back there again. But again, that's something of a theory. But as we've got no evidence of what happened to them after that, I'm assuming that after around 50 years, so up to about 1700 or thereabouts, most of them probably would have gone, and those that remained would have established then the synagogue in the outskirts of the city.
This is from an anonymous attendee. Since many Jews were driven to leave Spain due to the Inquisition,
yeah,
is there an explanation for why they chose to go to Ireland, another Catholic-dominated country?
For economic reasons. It's really as simple as that. That, remember, they weren't specifically coming to Ireland; they were specifically coming to Britain. There were economic benefits once the community, the small community, was settled in Britain. You know, in London and in York and places like this. Once they were settled, well, then, you know, Dublin was the second city of the Commonwealth. So I mean that there were advantages to them to you know, expand their network, you might say, their business networks over to Ireland. So I mean the religion didn't have much to do with it. And remember, though it was a Catholic country, under Cromwell, Catholicism was how would you put it? The Protestant religion was in the ascendancy at the time. So though Ireland was nominally a Catholic country, it wouldn't have been seen quite that way at the time. So it would have been seen as a safe place, because although the majority of the population was Catholic, a lot of them were actually practicing in secret themselves. It was a difficult time for Catholics, you know, until Cromwell was deposed, effectively. So that's really why. It's not that they came directly to Ireland, but it was just expedient to do so to expand the business networks.
Interesting. Okay, we have time for a few more. This one's from Sarah Price. It says the 1880s were a time of social upheaval and the emergence of the Fenian government.
Yeah.
Was there any, or Fenian government, was there any crossover between Russian Jews and the emerging social upheaval there and the Fenian movement in Ireland? And can you please explain the Fenian movement?
The Fenian movement was the sort of resurgence of Irish nationalism, because as I said, Ireland was ruled by Britain for a very, very long time. And I suppose the re-establishment of, a specific Irish identity, which then and now is very much associated with Irish Catholicism. But at the time, there was this move, and there were moves later. There were moves, in the 1920s to essentially re-establish Irish culture, and that was very much what the Fenian movement was about. It was about let's actually establish Irish culture, and there were actually quite a number of important Protestant members of that who actually saw, yes, it's time that we had Irish culture. It's time that we had an independence movement, which is also what the Fenians are very much established with, was Irish independence, which took a number of twists and turns before that was established in 1922. But that was essentially the Fenian movement. It was kind of a revolutionary movement, I suppose, against British rule. You're asking about the sort of Russian Jewish crossover. There is some, but you find it later. You find it more in the early 19th century. You certainly with the rise of communism. That's when you find far more of a crossover, because at the time when Jews settled here in the 1880s, they're in survival mode. They're not really interested in the local politics. That they're trying essentially to, they've escaped from a very, very toxic situation in the Russian Federation, and they're essentially trying to live their lives. So yes, there is a political crossover, but we have to wait 10 or 20 years, and I'll talk a bit about that next week if you like and you're interested in that. I will do that.
Wonderful. We're gonna have time for about 1 or 2 more questions, but I want to emphasize that there will be a part 2 and a part 3 to this series. You can look in our comments section to register. Again, it's free. You just need to click on the link and register, and those will talk about more about the 20th century. I know a lot of these questions that you have submitted that are wonderful should wait till then, so you could get a more a broader look at Irish history.
It'll be much more interesting than lots of pictures.
Another from Anonymous, can we presume that all of these historic synagogues had a rabbi and a minyan?
They all had a minyan. They didn't all have rabbis. That's fair to say. The larger synagogues, which came a bit later, they all had rabbanim. We had a chief rabbi, we had a dayan, we had all these positions. But those smaller ones, no. I mean, they were very much led by congregants. A couple of them had their own rabbis, but mostly they didn't.
Great. And our last question is, I was wondering, this is from Carol and Ira Bloom. I was wondering what was happening during this time in Belfast. Was it similar to the Dublin area?
It was similar to the Dublin area, but there was a smaller settlement of Jews, and without wishing to get too strongly into the politics of Northern Ireland, which are quite frankly a nightmare, and I don't really want to do this, but I think I mentioned to you about the plantation and the settlement in the time of Cromwell. So, Belfast society is already very different. And quite a number of Jews that settled in Belfast would have already been settled in Glasgow. So socially and culturally, they're somewhat different to the Irish, to the Southern Irish Jews, or how those communities evolved. Now, I will talk to you more next week, but there are some parallels. There was only one synagogue established there. There was also small Jewish communities around Derry, which is a bit further north and west. You're going right up to the top of the country there. There was a small Jewish community there. So it was quite scattered. It was a little bit scattered. But the Jewish community in Belfast, it never grew very large, and it certainly dwindled even earlier than the one in Dublin did. But you could argue, yeah, at the close of the 19th century, yeah, there's certainly parallels in terms of there are people coming from the Russian Federation. But I think a lot of the people, as I said, in Belfast had stopped in Britain, and certainly in Scotland first. A lot of them had married there and then come over to Belfast. It was cheaper to live there. That was one of the reasons.
This has been a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to all of our listeners. Please tune in next week for part 2 and the week after for part 3. Have a great rest of your day.